What if I told you that in a small Missouri town in 2024, a young woman was literally being sold to pay off debts, and the only person who stepped forward to save her was a struggling single father who could barely afford his next meal? This isn't a story from centuries past. This is Maya Rodriguez's story, and it happened just last year in Cedar Falls, Missouri, where desperation and corruption created the unthinkable, and where one man's quiet courage changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Rodriguez had always been different in Cedar Falls, not because she wanted to be, but because circumstances had carved her into something the small farming town didn't quite know how to handle. At 22, she possessed a fierce independence that both impressed and intimidated those around her. Her grandmother, Rosa Rodriguez, used to say Maya had the strength of 10 women, but that strength had been tested in ways no young person should ever endure. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where 3 generations of families lived within walking distance of each other, where the high school football team's victories were front-page news, and where everyone knew exactly how much money you made and whether you tithed properly at Sunday service. It was also a place where the Blackwood family had owned most of the farmland for over 60 years, and where their word carried more weight than the law itself. Maya lived in the small apartment above Chun's Market with her ailing grandmother, working 3 jobs to keep them afloat. She cleaned offices before dawn, waited tables at the Riverside Diner during lunch rushes, and stocked shelves at the market until closing. Her hands were always moving, always working, because stopping meant thinking about how precarious their situation really was. Rosa had raised Maya after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. The old woman had sacrificed everything for her granddaughter's education and well-being, even taking out loans against their small family property to pay for Maya's community college courses. Maya was studying to become a nurse, determined to build a life that would honor her grandmother's sacrifices and maybe, just maybe, give them both some security. But rural Missouri had been hit hard by economic changes that left small towns like Cedar Falls struggling to survive. The younger generation moved to cities for opportunities, leaving behind aging populations and shrinking tax bases. The Blackwood family had adapted by buying up struggling farms and consolidating land, becoming even more powerful as their neighbors grew more desperate. Victor Blackwood was a man who believed money could solve any problem and create any solution he desired. At 58, he was wealthy enough to own half the county, but cruel enough to use that power without conscience. He had watched Maya grow up with the calculating gaze of someone who saw people as assets to be acquired, rather than human beings deserving of respect. When Rosa's medical bills began mounting after her diabetes complications, Maya found herself drowning in debt despite working herself to exhaustion. The medical system that should have helped them instead became a trap of copays, deductibles, and treatments that insurance deemed unnecessary. Maya sold everything of value they owned, picked up additional work cleaning Blackwood's estate, and still watched the numbers in their bank account dwindle toward zero. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in October when Maya arrived at the estate to find Victor waiting for her in his study. The room smelled of leather and expensive cigars, filled with the kind of furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Maya had cleaned this room dozens of times, but never with its owner present, watching her every movement with eyes that made her skin crawl. Victor didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spread papers across his mahogany desk and gestured for Maya to sit in the chair across from him. The papers detailed every debt Rosa owed, every loan payment that was behind, every medical bill that had gone to collections. The total was staggering, more money than Maya could earn in 5 years of her current wages. But Victor had a solution. He explained with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Maya was young, beautiful, and untouched by any man. In certain circles, he continued, such purity commanded a premium price. There were wealthy men who would pay handsomely for the privilege of being Maya's first, and Victor knew exactly how to arrange such transactions. The proposal was dressed in business language, but Maya understood exactly what he was suggesting. She was to become a commodity, her innocence and desperation packaged and sold to the highest bidder. In return, her grandmother's debts would disappear, and Rosa could receive the medical care she needed without Maya having to worry about bankruptcy. Maya's first instinct was to run, to grab her grandmother and flee Cedar Falls entirely. But Rosa was too sick to travel, too weak to start over somewhere else. And Victor made it clear that refusing his offer would result in immediate foreclosure on their property and cancellation of Rosa's medical insurance. In a town where the Blackwood name opened doors and closed them with equal ease, Maya would find herself unemployable and homeless within weeks. The realization that she had no real choice felt like drowning in daylight. Maya had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to work hard and create her own opportunities. But the system had been rigged against people like her from the beginning, and Victor Blackwood was simply making that reality explicit. 3 days later, Maya found herself standing in the parlor of the Blackwood estate, wearing a simple blue dress that Victor had insisted she purchase for the occasion. The room had been transformed into something resembling an auction house, with chairs arranged in neat rows and a small platform at the front where Maya was expected to present herself to potential buyers. The men who filed into the room were exactly what Maya had expected: wealthy, middle-aged, and carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of people who believed money entitled them to whatever they desired. They looked at Maya with appraising eyes, discussing her attributes in clinical terms, as if she were livestock being evaluated for purchase. Judge Harold Morrison served as the auctioneer, lending an air of legal legitimacy to proceedings that should have been criminal. Morrison had been in Victor's pocket for years, rubber-stamping property deals and court decisions that benefited the Blackwood interests while maintaining the fiction of judicial independence. As Morrison explained the terms of the arrangement, Maya forced herself to stand straight and keep her eyes fixed on a point just above the assembled crowd. She had promised herself she wouldn't break down, wouldn't give these men the satisfaction of seeing her fear. But inside, she felt herself fragmenting, losing pieces of who she had always believed herself to be. The bidding started at $10,000, and Maya watched the numbers climb with a detached horror that felt like watching her own funeral. These men were purchasing not just her body, but her agency, her right to choose her own path through life. The highest bidder would own her for a weekend, and after that, Maya wasn't sure what would be left of the person she used to be. But as Judge Morrison called for final bids, the room fell silent. No one had noticed the man who slipped in through the side door, dressed in work clothes and carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from too many long days and not enough sleep. Daniel Carter had heard rumors about what was happening at the Blackwood estate, whispers that had reached him through the network of mechanics, farmers, and working people who made up the backbone of Cedar Falls. Dan was 35 years old and had been raising his 7-year-old daughter Sophie alone since his wife died in childbirth. He owned Carter's Auto Repair, a small shop that barely kept them afloat, but gave him the flexibility to be present for Sophie's school plays and soccer games. Dan understood struggle in a way that the wealthy men in Victor's parlor never could, and he recognized the look in Maya's eyes because he had seen it in his own mirror during the darkest months after his wife's death. When Dan raised his hand and spoke a number that was higher than any previous bid, the room turned to stare at this unexpected intruder. He didn't belong here among the wealthy and connected, and his presence disrupted the genteel fiction that what was happening was somehow acceptable because it was being conducted by respectable people in expensive clothes. Victor Blackwood's face flushed with anger at this disruption to his carefully orchestrated event. He began to object, to point out that Dan clearly couldn't afford the bid he had made. But Judge Morrison surprised everyone by banging his gavel and declaring the auction closed. Perhaps even Morrison had limits to how far he was willing to bend the law. Or perhaps he simply wanted to end a proceeding that was becoming messier than anyone had anticipated. Dan approached the platform where Maya stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. He didn't grab her or make demands or assume ownership the way she had expected. Instead, he simply said, "My truck's outside if you want to leave." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words were quiet enough that only Maya could hear them, and they contained something she hadn't expected: choice. Dan wasn't claiming her as property or asserting rights over her body. He was offering her an alternative to the horror she had been facing, with no strings attached and no expectations beyond basic human decency. Maya looked into Dan's eyes and saw none of the predatory hunger that had characterized the other men in the room. She saw exhaustion and worry and a kind of gentle strength that reminded her of her grandfather, who had died when she was 15, but who had always made her feel safe in an uncertain world. Without a word, Maya stepped down from the platform and followed Dan toward the door. Behind them, Victor Blackwood was shouting about contracts and legal obligations, but Maya didn't look back. For the first time in months, she was making a choice about her own life, and that feeling was worth whatever consequences might follow. Dan's truck was old and battered, held together by determination and creative repair work, but it started on the first try and carried them away from the Blackwood estate into the fading light of evening. Maya sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for her future. They drove in silence through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, past the high school where Maya had graduated valedictorian, past the diner where she still had a shift scheduled for tomorrow morning, past all the places that had seemed like her entire world until this moment when everything had changed. Dan finally broke the silence as they pulled into the parking lot of his auto repair shop. "I've got a couch in the office," he said simply. "You can stay there tonight if you want. No obligations, no expectations. Just a safe place to sleep while you figure out what comes next." Maya turned to look at him properly for the first time, studying the lines around his eyes that spoke of worry and responsibility, the calloused hands that told stories of honest work, the patient way he waited for her response without pushing for an answer. In the space of an hour, this stranger had shown her more respect and consideration than the entire town of Cedar Falls had managed in months of watching her struggle. "Why?" Maya asked, the question barely a whisper. Dan was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the empty street beyond his shop. "Because everyone deserves better than what was happening in that room," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like to feel like the whole world is against you." Maya felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built to protect herself from hoping for kindness in a world that had shown her so little of it. She nodded once, accepting his offer, and followed him into the small office behind the repair bays where a fold-out couch waited under a window that looked out onto the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. As Dan gathered blankets and pillows from a storage closet, Maya realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't calculating how many hours of work it would take to pay for her next meal or her grandmother's medication. For one night at least, she could simply exist without the crushing weight of financial desperation determining her every choice. Dan left her with a bottle of water, a sandwich he had packed for his own lunch, and the quiet assurance that he would be in the apartment upstairs if she needed anything. As his footsteps faded up the narrow staircase, Maya finally allowed herself to cry, not from despair this time, but from the overwhelming relief of discovering that there were still people in the world who believed in doing the right thing simply because it was right. Outside, Cedar Falls settled into the rhythm of another quiet evening, unaware that the lives of two of its residents had just become intertwined in ways that would change everything for both of them. Maya pulled the blankets around herself and closed her eyes, listening to the distant sounds of the town she had always called home and wondering, for the first time in years, what tomorrow might bring besides struggle and fear. In the apartment above, Dan sat at his kitchen table, staring at his bank account on his laptop screen and trying to figure out how he was going to pay the money he had bid without destroying his own precarious financial situation. But as he thought about the look in Maya's eyes when she realized she had a choice, he knew he would find a way to make it work, even if it meant taking on extra jobs or selling the truck he had been restoring in his spare time. Some things Dan had learned through his own struggles were worth any sacrifice, and giving Rosa Rodriguez her freedom back was definitely one of them. Maya woke to the sound of metal clanging against metal and the distant hum of an air compressor. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her mind still caught between sleep and the nightmare that had become her reality. Then the scent of motor, oil and coffee filtered through her consciousness, and she remembered the repair shop, Dan Carter. The impossible choice that had somehow led to this small office, couch instead of a hotel room with a stranger who had purchased her like property. Pale morning light filtered through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air above her makeshift bed. Maya sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on the narrow couch, and tried to piece together what came next. She had escaped Victor Blackwood's auction, but the debts that had driven her there hadn't magically disappeared. Rosa still needed medical care they couldn't afford, and Maya still had no clear path forward that didn't lead back to the same desperate circumstances. The sound of a child's laughter drifted down from the apartment upstairs, followed by the deeper rumble of Dan's voice. Maya realized she had slept later than usual, probably past 8 if the level of activity in the shop was any indication. She folded the blankets neatly and tried to smooth her wrinkled dress, acutely aware that she had no other clothes, no toothbrush, no plan beyond surviving the next few hours. A soft knock on the office door interrupted her thoughts. "Maya?" Dan's voice was careful, respectful of her privacy, even in his own building. "I made extra coffee if you want some." "No pressure, just thought you might be awake." Maya opened the door to find Dan holding 2 mismatched ceramic mugs, steam rising from both. He was dressed in work clothes, his hands already stained with grease despite the early hour. Behind him, a small girl with dark curls peeked around his legs, studying Maya with the uninhibited curiosity of childhood. "This is Sophie," Dan said, resting a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Sophie, this is Maya. She's going to be staying with us for a little while." Sophie stepped forward with the confidence of a child who had been raised to be polite, but not afraid. "Daddy says you needed help," she said matter-of-factly. "We're good at helping people. Daddy fixed Mrs. Patterson's car for free when she couldn't pay, and I helped by organizing all his tools." Maya accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug and breathing in the rich aroma. "Thank you," she managed, looking between Dan and Sophie. "Both of you. I know this is a lot to ask of strangers." "We're not strangers anymore," Sophie declared with the simple logic of childhood. "Strangers don't share breakfast, and Daddy made pancakes. Do you like pancakes? I helped flip them, but one of them looks like a dinosaur because I'm still learning." Despite everything, Maya found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "I love pancakes," she said, and meant it. When was the last time someone had made her breakfast without expecting anything in return? When was the last time she had eaten a meal that wasn't grabbed between work shifts or carefully rationed to make groceries last until the next paycheck? The apartment above the shop was small but comfortable, filled with the kind of lived-in warmth that came from people who genuinely cared about each other. Sophie's artwork covered the refrigerator, and family photos lined the mantel above a modest fireplace. Maya could see Dan's wife in some of the pictures, a woman with kind eyes and Sophie's same bright smile, and she felt a pang of grief for this family's loss. Dan served breakfast on plates that didn't match but were clean and cheerful, and Sophie chattered about school and her upcoming class project on community helpers. Maya listened, contributing when spoken to, but mostly absorbing the normalcy of this morning routine. She had forgotten what it felt like to sit at a table without calculating the cost of every bite, without mentally reviewing her work schedule to figure out when she could next afford to eat. After breakfast, Dan sent Sophie to brush her teeth and gather her school backpack, then turned to Maya with an expression that was serious but not unkind. "I need to ask," he said quietly, "what you want to do about the money situation with Blackwood. I bid more than I actually have, and eventually, that's going to be a problem. But more importantly, I want to make sure you're making choices because you want to, not because you feel trapped again." Maya stared into her coffee cup, appreciating his directness even as it brought her crashing back to reality. "I don't. No," she admitted. "I can't go back to my grandmother's apartment. Victor owns the building, and even if he didn't, the neighbors all saw what happened yesterday. They'll either treat me like I'm damaged goods or like I'm some kind of threat to their own daughters." Dan nodded, understanding more than she had expected. "What about your grandmother? Is she safe where she is?" "For now," Maya said. "She's in the extended care facility at the county hospital. They can't discharge her without somewhere for her to go. And technically Victor's arrangement was supposed to cover her bills. But if he decides to revoke that because you interfered..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Sophie reappeared with her backpack, ready for school and oblivious to the adult complications swirling around her. Dan kissed her forehead and handed her a lunchbox decorated with cartoon characters. "Mrs. Patterson is going to pick you up after school and keep you until I'm done with work, okay? Be good for her." "I'm always good," Sophie replied with mock indignation. "Tell Maya I saved her some of my colored pencils in case she wants to draw while we're gone. They're the good kind that don't break." After Dan left to drive Sophie to school, Maya found herself alone in the apartment, surrounded by the quiet evidence of other people's lives. She washed the breakfast dishes carefully, not because Dan had asked her to, but because she needed something to do with her hands while her mind processed everything that had changed in the span of 24 hours. The colored pencils Sophie had mentioned were arranged neatly on the coffee table next to a coloring book and several sheets of blank paper. Maya picked up a blue pencil and found herself sketching without conscious thought, her hand moving across the paper as she tried to work through the tangle of emotions and possibilities crowding her thoughts. She was drawing the view from the apartment window, the quiet street lined with modest houses and mature trees, when Dan returned from the school run. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene of Maya curled in the corner of his couch with art supplies scattered around her. "Sophie will be thrilled," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "She's been trying to get me to draw with her for months, but I'm pretty hopeless at anything more complicated than stick figures." Maya set down the pencil and looked at Dan properly, noting the worry lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders carried tension even in his own home. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Take care of me, I mean. You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect. If you can figure out a way to get out of the bid without getting in trouble, I'll understand." Dan was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the street where he had grown up, where he was trying to raise his daughter with some measure of stability and safety. "Can I tell you something?" he said finally. "When my wife died, this whole town rallied around us, brought casseroles, offered to babysit Sophie, helped with the funeral arrangements. Everyone wanted to do something to make it better, even though nothing could actually make it better." Maya listened, sensing that this story was important, that it explained something about the choice Dan had made the night before. But then the immediate crisis passed. Dan continued, Sophie and I figured out how to function as a family of two, and people went back to their own lives. Which is normal, I understand that. But there were still nights when Sophie had nightmares about losing me too. Still days when I could barely get out of bed. Still moments when I felt like we were drowning, even though everyone thought we were fine. He met Maya's eyes and she saw her own exhaustion reflected there, the bone-deep weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. What I learned, Dan said, is that sometimes people need help in ways that aren't obvious, and sometimes the help they need isn't temporary. Sometimes you have to be willing to commit to someone's well-being for the long haul, not just until the immediate crisis passes. Maya felt her throat tighten with emotion she didn't have words for. "But you don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough," Dan replied. "I know you worked 3 jobs to take care of your grandmother. I know you stood on that platform last night with your chin up instead of falling apart. I know you folded the blankets this morning even though you had every right to leave them in a pile. And I know that what happened to you was wrong, and if I can do something about it, I should." The simplicity of his reasoning was staggering. Maya had spent so long navigating a world where every kindness came with strings attached, where every offer of help was really a transaction in disguise, that she had forgotten people like Dan existed. People who helped because it was right, not because it benefited them. A customer's car pulled into the lot below, and Dan glanced at his watch. "I need to get back to work," he said, standing. "But I want you to know that you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to figure things out. Sophie likes having you around, and honestly, so do I. This place has been pretty quiet since it's just been the 2 of us." As Dan headed downstairs to the shop, Maya returned to her sketch, adding details to the houses and trees, trying to capture the sense of peace she felt looking out at this ordinary street, where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. For the first time since her parents died, she could imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere, to have people who cared about her well-being without expecting anything in return. The phone rang sometime after lunch, jolting Maya from the book she had found on Dan's shelf. She hesitated before answering, uncertain whether she should pick up someone else's calls, but the persistent ringing eventually won out. "Carter Auto Repair," she said tentatively. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end was sharp, authoritative, and immediately familiar. Victor Blackwood. Maya's hand tightened on the receiver, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Dan's not available right now. Can I take a message?" "I know who this is," Victor said, his tone carrying the cold satisfaction of a man who enjoyed having power over others. "Ms. Rodriguez, I thought you should know that your grandmother's insurance coverage has been suspended pending resolution of yesterday's irregularities. She has 48 hours to arrange alternative payment for her care, or should be discharged." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. She sank into Dan's desk chair, fighting to keep her voice level. "You can't do that. She's too sick to be discharged." "I can do whatever I choose," Victor replied. "As can you. The original arrangement stands. Honor your commitment, and your grandmother continues to receive the care she needs. Continue this foolish rebellion and face the consequences." The line went dead, leaving Maya staring at the phone with trembling hands. 48 hours. Rosa couldn't survive being discharged from the hospital, couldn't return to an apartment they could no longer afford, couldn't manage her diabetes without the medical supervision she was receiving. Victor knew this, was counting on Maya's love for her grandmother to force her back into the arrangement that would destroy her. Maya was still sitting in shock when Dan returned from a parts run, taking one look at her face and immediately crossing to kneel beside the chair. "What happened?" She told him about the call, watching his expression grow grimmer with each detail. When she finished, Dan was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed the implications of Victor's ultimatum. "We'll figure this out," he said finally. "There has to be another way." There isn't, Maya said, despair creeping into her voice. Victor owns half this town, including the bank that holds the hospital's mortgage. If he wants my grandmother discharged, she be discharged, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Dan stood and began pacing the small office, his mind clearly working through possibilities. What if we could find another facility, somewhere outside Victor's influence? With what money? Maya asked. Even if I could get her transferred, I still can't afford the care she needs. That's how this whole nightmare started. The bell above the shop door chimed, signaling another customer, and Dan glanced toward the front of the building with frustration. He had work to do, bills to pay, a daughter to support, and Maya knew he was beginning to understand the impossible position she was in. I should go, Maya said, standing up from the chair. This isn't your problem, and I can't keep dragging you into Victor's games. He'll come after your business next, or find some way to hurt Sophie. I won't be responsible for that. Sit down, Dan said firmly. You're not going anywhere. And this is my problem now, because I made it my problem. When I bid on you last night, we're going to find a solution that doesn't involve you sacrificing yourself to that predator. Maya wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that there was a way out of the trap Victor had so carefully constructed. But she had learned the hard way that wanting something and being able to achieve it were very different things. Sometimes, love meant making the sacrifice that would protect the people you cared about, even if it destroyed you in the process. As Dan went to help his customer, Maya stared out the window at the peaceful street beyond, knowing that she had less than 2 days to choose between her own freedom and her grandmother's life, and knowing, deep in her heart, what choice she would have to make. The afternoon passed in a haze of growing dread. Maya tried to read, tried to focus on the children's television program that played softly in the background, tried to sketch more scenes from the window, but her mind kept returning to Victor's ultimatum and the impossible choice it represented. She had found something precious here with Dan and Sophie, a glimpse of what family could look like when it was built on care rather than obligation. But that glimpse would have to be enough. When Sophie returned from school, bursting through the apartment door with the boundless energy of a 7-year-old, Maya forced herself to smile and ask about the little girl's day. Sophie chattered about her math test and the new boy in her class who spoke only Spanish, and Maya found herself memorizing these details, storing them away like treasures she could revisit later when her life became something unrecognizable again. Are you sad? Sophie asked suddenly, her child's intuition cutting through Maya's careful facade. You look like Daddy did after Mommy went to heaven, all far away inside. Maya knelt down to Sophie's eye level, taking the little girl's hands in her own. Sometimes grown-ups have hard problems to solve, she said gently. But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong, okay? You've been nothing but kind to me. Sophie considered this with the seriousness that children brought to adult emotions they didn't fully understand. Daddy says hard problems get easier when people help each other. Maybe we can help with your problem too. The innocent offer broke something open in Maya's chest. This child, who had already lost her mother, was willing to share her father and her home with a stranger who brought nothing but complications to their lives. Sophie's generosity highlighted the magnitude of what Maya was about to lose, but also reminded her why she had to make the sacrifice. Dan appeared in the doorway, home from work with grease still under his fingernails and worry etched across his features. He and Maya exchanged a look over Sophie's head, a silent communication that spoke of time running out and options growing. Finn, how about we make dinner together? Dan suggested, his tone deliberately light for Sophie's benefit. Maya, do you know how to make spaghetti? Sophie's been trying to teach me, but I think I need backup. They cooked together in the small kitchen, Maya and Sophie working on the sauce while Dan boiled water and tried not to overcook the pasta. The domestic scene felt both perfectly natural and heartbreakingly temporary. A glimpse of the life Maya might have had if circumstances had been different. During dinner, Sophie dominated the conversation with stories from school and plans for the weekend, her chatter filling the spaces where adult worries might have intruded. Maya found herself laughing at Sophie's impression of her teacher, amazed that she could still find joy even with the weight of tomorrow's deadline pressing down on her. After Sophie went to bed, Dan and Maya sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee growing cold between them. The apartment felt different with the little girl asleep, quieter but also more intimate, as if the walls had moved closer to create a space that belonged only to the two adults who shared this impossible situation. "I've been thinking," Dan said finally, "about liquidating some assets. I could sell my tools, maybe take out a loan against the shop. It wouldn't be enough to cover everything, but it might buy us time to find another solution." Maya shook her head before he could finish. "I can't let you do that. This shop is your livelihood, Sophie's security. I won't be responsible for destroying that. And I won't be responsible for letting you walk back into that nightmare," Dan replied, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Maya look up from her coffee cup. "There has to be another way." "Sometimes there isn't," Maya said softly. "Sometimes you have to choose between bad options and worse ones, and you make the choice that protects the people you love." Dan reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the contact warm and solid and reassuring. "What if someone loves you too? What if your protection matters to them as much as your grandmother's protection matters to you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Maya wasn't sure she was ready to examine. In the space of 2 days, this man had shown her more genuine care than she had received from anyone except Rosa in years. But loving someone and being able to protect them were different things, and Maya had learned the hard way that love alone wasn't always enough to change impossible circumstances. "Victor won't stop," Maya said, pulling her hand back reluctantly. "Even if we found a way to pay for Rosa's care, he'd find another way to pressure me. He spent too much time setting this up to just walk away now. And eventually, he'll start targeting you and Sophie to get to me. I can't live with that." Dan was quiet for a long moment, studying Maya's face in the soft light of the kitchen lamp. "What if I told you that I've been thinking about leaving? Cedar Falls anyway. That this place has too many memories, and Sophie and I might be happier starting fresh somewhere else?" Maya stared at him, wondering if he was serious or just trying to make her feel better about the impossible situation. "You can't uproot your entire life because of my problems. Maybe they're not just your problems anymore," Dan said. "Maybe when you care about someone, their problems become your problems, and you figure out solutions together instead of trying to handle everything alone." The idea was seductive, dangerous in its appeal. Maya could imagine it, the three of them in a different town, building a life together without Victor Blackwood's shadow hanging over everything. But imagination and reality were different things, and Maya had learned not to trust dreams that seemed too good to be true. "Even if we could manage that," Maya said, "it would take time to arrange. Time we don't have. Rosa needs care now, and I can't gamble with her life while we figure out an escape plan." Dan nodded slowly, understanding the position Maya was in even as he struggled against it. "So what are you saying?" Maya met his eyes, trying to memorize the kindness she saw there, the concern that had no agenda attached to it. "I'm saying that tomorrow, I'm going to call Victor and tell him I'll honor the original arrangement. And I'm saying that tonight is probably the last night I'll be able to spend as myself, so I want to remember what it felt like to be part of a family again." The admission cost her everything she had left, but it also felt like a gift. For one night, she could pretend that this was her real life, that she belonged here with these people who cared about her well-being more than her usefulness. Tomorrow would bring its own horrors, but tonight belonged to them. Dan reached for her hand again, this time holding on when she tried to pull away. "Maya," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer, like a promise, like everything she had ever wanted to hear. "We're going to figure this out. I don't know how yet, but we're going to find a way that doesn't require you to sacrifice yourself. Just give me a little more time." Maya wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that love and determination could overcome money and power and the systematic cruelty of people like Victor Blackwood. But time was the one thing they didn't have, and hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. Outside, Cedar Falls settled into another quiet evening, unaware that inside a small apartment above an auto repair shop, two people were falling in love just in time to have their hearts broken by circumstances beyond their control. Dawn came too soon, filtering through the apartment windows with the pale gray light that promised another day Maya wasn't ready to face. She had slept fitfully on the couch, her dreams filled with images of hospital rooms and empty apartment buildings, of Victor Blackwood's cold smile and the sound of Rosa's labored breathing. Each time she woke, the weight of the approaching deadline pressed down on her chest like a physical thing, making it hard to draw a full breath. The sounds of morning routine drifted from the kitchen, where Dan was preparing breakfast and packing Sophie's lunch. Maya could hear the clink of dishes, the soft murmur of father and daughter discussing the day ahead, the ordinary domestic symphony that had become precious to her in its normalcy. In a few hours, she would have to make the phone call that would end all of this, that would trade these moments of belonging for the medical care that would keep Rosa alive. Maya rose quietly and folded the blankets with the same careful attention she had given them every morning since arriving at Dan's shop. The ritual had become important to her, a way of showing respect for the kindness she had been given, and perhaps a way of maintaining some small measure of control in a situation where she had so little. Each crease in the fabric was deliberate, each fold a tiny act of gratitude for the safety she had found here. Sophie appeared in the living room doorway, already dressed for school but moving with less than her usual boundless energy. The little girl had picked up on the tension that filled the apartment, despite the adults' attempts to shield her from their worries. Children, Maya had learned, were remarkably perceptive about the emotional currents that surrounded them, even when they didn't understand the specifics of what was happening. "Are you still sad?" Sophie asked, settling beside Maya on the couch with the directness that children brought to difficult questions. "Daddy was up really late walking around the kitchen. He does that when he's worried about something big." Maya pulled Sophie closer, breathing in the scent of the strawberry shampoo Dan used on his daughter's hair. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices," she said carefully. "But that doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen to you or your daddy. You're safe here, okay?" Sophie studied Maya's face with the intensity of a child trying to decode. "Adult emotions, are you safe here too?" she asked. The question hit Maya harder than she had expected. Safety was such a simple concept for a child, but it had become impossibly complicated in Maya's world. She was safe here in Dan's apartment, protected by his presence and his determination to help her. But that safety was temporary, conditional, on choices that were being made by people who saw her as property rather than a person. "I'm safe right now," Maya said, which was true enough for the moment. "And that's what matters." Dan emerged from the kitchen with Sophie's backpack and a travel mug of coffee, his movements efficient, but lacking their usual easy confidence. Maya could see the strain in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he thought. No one was looking. He had spent the night trying to solve an unsolvable problem, searching for alternatives that didn't exist within the time frame they had been given. After Sophie left for school, the apartment felt different, charged with the weight of unspoken decisions and the approaching deadline. Dan returned from the school run with a determined expression that Maya recognized as the look of a man who had made up his mind about something. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and pulled out a notebook filled with figures and calculations, the evidence of his sleepless night spent searching for solutions. "I talked to Tommy Sullivan this morning," Dan said without preamble. He's been wanting to buy into the business for years, turn it into a partnership. If I sell him a 40% stake, that would give us enough to cover your grandmother's immediate medical bills and buy us time to figure out a more permanent solution. Maya stared at the notebook, seeing the careful columns of numbers that represented Dan's attempt to quantify hope. "You can't do that," she said quietly. "This shop is everything you've built for Sophie's future. I won't let you sacrifice that for my problems." "It's not a sacrifice if it's a choice I want to make," Dan replied. "Tommy's a good mechanic and a better man. The partnership would actually strengthen the business, give us more capacity to take on bigger jobs. And it would mean you don't have to go back to Victor Blackwood." The offer was generous beyond anything Maya had expected, but it was also impossible to accept. She had spent too many years watching Rosa sacrifice her own security for Maya's well-being to willingly become the reason another family's stability was compromised. Love, Maya had learned, sometimes meant refusing the very help you needed most. "What happens when Victor decides that's not enough?" Maya asked. "What happens when he finds other ways to pressure me? Or when he decides to target you and Sophie to get what he wants?" "This isn't just about money, Dan. It's about power, and Victor isn't going to give up just because we found a way to pay Rosa's bills." Dan's expression grew darker as he absorbed the truth of what Maya was saying. Victor Blackwood wasn't simply a creditor looking to collect a debt. He was a predator who had invested considerable time and effort in orchestrating Maya's downfall. Men like Victor didn't walk away from their prey just because someone else offered to pay their price. "Then we leave," Dan said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "All of us. I've been thinking about it all night, and maybe it's time for a fresh start anyway. Sophie and I could use a change of scenery, somewhere without so many reminders of everything we've lost." Maya felt her heart skip at the possibility he was presenting, the vision of a life where she could be part of this family without bringing danger to their door. But even as part of her wanted to grab onto the hope he was offering, the practical side of her mind cataloged all the reasons why it wouldn't work. "Where would we go?" she asked. "And what would we do when we got there?" "Victor has connections beyond Cedar Falls. If he really wants to find me, changing towns won't be enough to stop him." Dan reached across the table and took her hands, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I have a cousin in Oregon who runs a logging operation. He's been after me for years to move out there and help him expand the business. The work would be different, but it would be honest work, and Oregon is far enough from Missouri that Victor's influence wouldn't reach." The plan was tempting in its simplicity, but Maya knew that running away would only delay the inevitable confrontation with Victor's power and determination. And even if they could successfully disappear, what kind of life would it be for Sophie, constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing if they were truly safe or just postponing the moment when their past caught up with them? "I can't ask you to turn your daughter into a refugee," Maya said softly. "Sophie deserves stability, a place where she can put down roots and make friends without worrying about having to leave suddenly. She's already lost her mother. I won't be responsible for taking away her home, too." Dan was quiet for a long moment, understanding the weight of Maya's concerns, even as he struggled against the helplessness they represented. "So what's the alternative?" he asked finally. "You call Victor and agree to his terms? You let him sell you to the highest bidder and hope that somehow your grandmother's care continues even after you're no longer in a position to negotiate?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the knowledge that there were no good answers to their situation. Maya had spent the night considering every possible option, turning over scenarios in her mind like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together into a complete picture. Every path forward seemed to lead to either her destruction or the endangerment of people she had come to care about. "Maybe there's another way," Maya said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Maybe if I go back to Victor but set Conditions: demand guarantees about Rosa's care and protection for you and Sophie. Maybe I can negotiate something that keeps everyone safe. Dan's expression hardened. You're talking about bargaining with a predator. Maya, men like Victor don't honor agreements unless they benefit from them. The moment you're no longer useful to him, any promises he makes will be worthless. Maya knew he was right, but she also knew that time was running out, and they were no closer to finding a solution that didn't require someone to make an impossible sacrifice. The phone sat on the kitchen counter like a loaded weapon, waiting for her to make the call that would end this brief glimpse of happiness and return her to the nightmare that Victor had so carefully constructed. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, causing both of them to freeze. Visitors were unusual at the shop during business hours, and the tentative nature of the knock suggested someone who wasn't entirely comfortable with their presence here. Dan rose cautiously and moved to the window, peering down at the parking lot below. "It's Rebecca Chun," he said, referring to the social worker who had been involved in Rosa's case. "She looks upset." Maya's stomach dropped as she followed Dan downstairs to the shop's front office. Rebecca Chun was a good woman who genuinely cared about her clients, but she was also constrained by bureaucratic regulations and the political realities of working in a town where the Blackwood family wielded considerable influence. Her presence here could only mean bad news. Rebecca entered the office with the careful movements of someone bearing unwelcome information. She was a small woman in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from years of fighting a system that often failed the people it was supposed to protect. Maya had liked her from their first meeting, recognizing in Rebecca the same exhaustion that came from caring too much in a world that didn't care enough. "Maya," Rebecca sighed, her voice gentle but strained. "I'm glad I found you. I need to talk to you about your grandmother's situation." Maya braced herself for confirmation of what she already knew, that Rosa's insurance had been canceled and that discharge proceedings were already underway. But Rebecca's next words carried information that was both better and worse than Maya had expected. "There's been a development," Rebecca continued. "Another family member has come forward, claiming responsibility for Rosa's care. Someone with both the financial means and the legal standing to make medical decisions on her behalf." Maya felt the world tilt around her as she processed this information. "What family member? Rosa doesn't have anyone else. It's just me." Rebecca consulted the papers she carried, though Maya suspected she already knew the information by heart. "A nephew, apparently. Eduardo Rodriguez, claiming to be Rosa's late brother's son. He's provided documentation of the family relationship and has arranged for Rosa's transfer to a private facility in Kansas City that specializes in diabetic care." The name meant nothing to Maya, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Rosa's family had been scattered by immigration and economic pressures decades ago, and there could easily be relatives Maya had never heard of. But the timing of this mysterious nephew's appearance was suspicious, coinciding perfectly with Victor's ultimatum and Maya's desperate situation. "Where is he?" Maya asked. "I want to meet him to verify that he's actually family." Rebecca's expression grew more uncomfortable. "That's the thing, Maya. Eduardo Rodriguez has requested that Rosa be moved today, and he specifically asked that you not be involved in the transition. He's claiming that you've been a negative influence on Rosa's health, that the stress of your financial difficulties has interfered with her medical care." The accusation hit Maya like a physical blow, even though she recognized it as a calculated lie designed to isolate her from the one person whose welfare had motivated all of her choices. This wasn't a long-lost relative stepping forward out of family loyalty. This was Victor Blackwood using his money and connections to create a scenario where Maya would be completely cut off from Rosa while appearing to have resolved the medical crisis that had driven Maya to desperation. "He's lying," Maya said, though she knew the truth of her words wouldn't matter in the face of official documentation and financial backing. Rosa doesn't have a nephew named Eduardo. This is Victor's doing, another way to manipulate me. Rebecca nodded sadly. I suspected as much, but my hands are tied. Eduardo Rodriguez has provided all the necessary legal documentation, and he has the financial means to provide Rosa with excellent care. From a bureaucratic standpoint, this solves all of our immediate problems, except that it separates me from my grandmother and puts her in the control of people who are using her as leverage against me. Maya replied, her voice rising with frustration. Doesn't that matter at all? It matters to me, Rebecca said quietly, but it doesn't matter to the system. As far as the official record is concerned, Rosa Rodriguez is getting the best possible care from a family member who can afford to provide it. The fact that it serves someone else's agenda is something I can suspect but can't prove. Dan, who had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, stepped forward. What if Maya contests this? Challenges the family relationship? Claim? Rebecca shook her head. It would take weeks or months to work through the legal system, and Rosa needs care now. Eduardo Rodriguez is offering immediate transfer to a facility that provides better care than she's currently receiving. Even if Maya eventually proved that the relationship was fraudulent, Rosa would probably be better off for having received the upgraded medical attention. Maya sank into the office chair, feeling the last of her options slip away like water through her fingers. Victor had outmaneuvered her completely, using the very love she felt for Rosa as the weapon that would force her compliance. By arranging for Rosa's care through a fictional relative, he had eliminated Maya's ability to use her grandmother's welfare as a negotiating point while simultaneously demonstrating the extent of his power and resources. When? Maya asked quietly. The transport is scheduled for this afternoon, Rebecca replied. I'm sorry, Maya. I know this isn't what you wanted, but from a practical standpoint, your grandmother is going to receive excellent care. That has to count for something. After Rebecca left, Maya and Dan sat in the shop office in stunned silence. The phone conversation Maya had been dreading was no longer necessary. Victor had already moved to the next phase of his plan without waiting for her response to his ultimatum. Rosa would be safe and well cared for, but she would also be completely beyond Maya's reach, held in a facility controlled by Victor's money and influence. He's good, Dan said finally, his voice carrying a grudging admiration for Victor's tactical skill. Eliminate your leverage while appearing to solve the problem that created the leverage in the first place. Now you can't use Rosa's welfare to justify refusing his other demands. Maya nodded numbly, understanding the elegance of the trap that had been constructed around her. With Rosa's care secured by fictional family members, Maya no longer had the excuse of protecting her grandmother to justify submitting to Victor's arrangement. But she also no longer had any way to ensure Rosa's continued safety if she refused to comply with Victor's wishes. What happens now? Dan asked. Maya was quiet for a long moment, staring out the office window at the ordinary street where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, uncompromised by the machinations of predators like Victor Blackwood. She had been given a brief glimpse of what that kind of life might feel like, had experienced the warmth of being part of a family that cared about her well-being without agenda or expectation. That glimpse would have to sustain her through whatever came next. Now I call Victor and tell him I'm ready to honor our original agreement, Maya said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Rosa is safe, so I don't have any more excuses to delay what's probably inevitable anyway. Dan turned to face her fully, his expression intense with emotion she couldn't quite read. What if I told you that I love you? He said quietly. What if I told you that these past few days have meant more to me than anything that's happened since my wife died? Would that change your decision? The words hit Maya with the force of everything she had wanted to hear and everything she couldn't afford to believe. She looked into Dan's eyes and saw sincerity there, genuine care that had nothing to do with what she could provide or how she could be useful. It was exactly the kind of love she had dreamed of finding, offered at exactly the moment when accepting it would endanger everyone she cared about. It would make leaving harder, Maya said honestly. But it wouldn't change what I have to do. Victor isn't going to stop just because we found something good together. He'll keep escalating until he gets what he wants, and eventually that escalation will threaten Sophie. I can't live with being responsible for that. Dan reached for her hands again, holding them tightly as if physical contact could somehow anchor her to this moment, to this choice to stay and fight for what they had found together. There has to be another way, he said. Some option we haven't considered yet. Maya wished she could share his optimism, but she had learned to recognize the difference between hope and denial. Victor Blackwood had spent months orchestrating this situation, using his money and influence to eliminate every alternative except the one that served his purposes. Fighting back would require resources they didn't have and time that had already run out. Maybe in another life, Maya said softly. Maybe in a world where money didn't buy the right to treat people like property, where small-town mechanics could stand up to wealthy estate owners without losing everything they'd worked to build. But not in this world, and not with these circumstances. The afternoon stretched ahead of them like a countdown to disaster, each passing hour bringing Maya closer to the phone call that would end this brief interlude of happiness and return her to the nightmare that Victor had constructed around her choices. She spent the time memorizing details, the way sunlight fell through the office windows, the sound of Dan's voice when he talked to customers, the distant laughter of children walking home from school. When Sophie returned from her day, Maya made sure to be fully present for the little girl's stories about math tests and playground games, storing away these moments of ordinary childhood joy like treasures she could revisit when her own life became something unrecognizable. Sophie seemed to sense that something important was happening, clinging closer to both Maya and Dan, as if her intuition warned her that their small family was about to change in ways she wouldn't understand. As evening approached and Sophie settled into her homework routine, Maya knew she couldn't delay any longer. The phone call had to be made, the surrender had to be offered, before Victor decided that her hesitation warranted additional punishment for the people she cared about. She had learned enough about his methods to know that escalation was always an option for men who viewed other people's suffering as acceptable collateral damage. Dan tried one more time to convince her to wait, to give him another day to explore options he hadn't yet considered. But Maya could see in his eyes that he knew the truth as well as she did. They were ordinary people caught in a web spun by someone with extraordinary resources and no moral constraints. Love and determination were powerful forces, but they weren't always enough to overcome the systematic advantages held by people who treated cruelty as a business strategy. Maya picked up the phone with hands that shook only slightly, proud that she could maintain even that much composure in the face of what she was about to do. She had found something precious in this apartment above an auto repair shop, had experienced what it felt like to be valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. That experience would have to be enough to sustain her through whatever came next, would have to serve as proof that goodness existed in the world, even when it couldn't triumph over the forces arrayed against it. The numbers on the phone seemed to blur as Maya prepared to dial Victor's private line, to offer the surrender he had always known she would eventually make. In the background, she could hear Sophie practicing piano and Dan moving around the kitchen, preparing dinner, the sounds of a family life she had been briefly allowed to share, but never truly allowed to claim. Tomorrow would bring horrors she could barely imagine, but tonight there was still this, the warmth of belonging, the sound of people who cared about her safety, the fragile miracle of being seen and valued and loved. Maya held on to that knowledge like a lifeline as she began to dial, knowing that some forms of wealth could never be bought or sold. only given freely by people who understood what it meant to choose love over fear. The phone rang once before Victor's voice answered, smooth and satisfied, and completely unsurprised by her call. Maya closed her eyes and began to speak the words that would trade her freedom for the illusion of others' safety, not knowing that, across town, other forces were already beginning to move in ways that would change everything she thought she knew about the choices available to her. Victor's voice carried the smooth satisfaction of a man who had never doubted the outcome of his carefully orchestrated game. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, drawing out her name with the deliberate pleasure of someone savoring a long-awaited victory. "I was beginning to wonder if you had learned to value your pride more than your grandmother's well-being." Maya gripped the phone tighter, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm ready to honor our arrangement," she said, each word feeling like swallowing glass. "But I want guarantees about Rosa's care, written documentation that her treatment will continue regardless of what happens to me." Victor's laughter was low and genuinely amused. "My dear girl, you're hardly in a position to make demands. Your grandmother is receiving excellent care from her loving nephew Eduardo, a situation that has nothing whatsoever to do with our private business arrangement. Surely you wouldn't want to complicate such a fortunate family reunion with unnecessary legal documentation." The casual dismissal of her concerns confirmed what Maya had already known. Victor held all the cards now, and he felt no obligation to pretend otherwise. Rosa's welfare had been secured through channels completely outside Maya's influence, eliminating her ability to negotiate for anything beyond the most basic terms of her own surrender. "When?" Maya asked, abandoning any pretense that she had choices left to make. "Tonight," Victor replied without hesitation. "I have a client who has been quite patient during these recent irregularities. He's waiting at the Grandview Hotel in Springfield, room 412. You'll present yourself there by 10 o'clock, properly prepared for an evening that will more than compensate him for the inconvenience of this delay." Maya closed her eyes, trying to prepare herself for what lay ahead while calculating how many hours of freedom she had left. Springfield was a 2-hour drive from Cedar Falls, which meant she would need to leave Dan's apartment within the next few hours to make Victor's deadline. The thought of walking away from the warmth and safety she had found here felt like voluntarily stepping into a grave. "And if I refuse?" Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then Eduardo Rodriguez might discover that his family obligations are more burdensome than he initially realized," Victor said, his tone growing colder. "Medical care is so expensive these days, particularly for elderly patients with complex conditions. It would be unfortunate if financial considerations forced him to reconsider the level of care he's able to provide." The threat was delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had never had to worry about the consequences of his actions for anyone except himself. Victor understood exactly how to maintain his leverage even after eliminating Maya's ability to negotiate, ensuring her compliance through the simple expedient of threatening the person she loved most. "I understand," Maya said, the words tasting like defeat. "Excellent," Victor replied. "I trust you'll present yourself appropriately. Mr. Harrison has very specific preferences, and first impressions are so important in establishing the proper dynamic for an ongoing relationship." The line went dead, leaving Maya staring at the phone with the crushing weight of inevitability settling over her like a physical presence. In the kitchen, she could hear Dan preparing dinner while Sophie practiced piano in the living room. The ordinary sounds of family life continuing despite the earthquake that had just shattered Maya's world. Dan appeared in the doorway as Maya hung up the phone, taking one look at her expression and immediately crossing to kneel beside her chair. "What did he say?" Maya told him about the hotel in Springfield, about the client who was waiting for her arrival, about the timeline that would require her to leave within hours. Dan listened with growing horror, his face darkening as he absorbed the reality of what Victor was demanding. "We're not letting this happen," Dan said firmly. "I don't care what it takes or what it costs. We'll figure out another way." Maya wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that love and determination could somehow overcome the systematic advantages held by people like Victor Blackwood. But she had learned the hard way that wanting something and being able to achieve it were very different things, particularly when the stakes included not just her own well-being, but the safety of people she had come to love. "What other way?" Maya asked. "Victor has Rosa completely under his control now, and he's made it clear that my compliance is the price of her continued care. If I run, he'll take it out on her. If I fight, he'll escalate until he finds pressure points that include you and Sophie. There's no scenario where everyone I care about stays safe, except the one where I do exactly what he wants." Dan stood and began pacing the small office, his mind clearly working through possibilities, even as Maya pointed out their impossibility. What if we could prove that Rosa Rodriguez doesn't exist? If we could expose Victor's manipulation of Rosa's care situation, with what evidence? Maya replied, "And even if we could prove it, how long would that take? Victor's client is expecting me tonight. Every hour I delay gives Victor more time to think of additional ways to pressure me." "Then we go to the police," Dan said. "What Victor is doing is human trafficking, pure and simple. There have to be laws against this kind of coercion." Maya shook her head sadly. "You think Judge Morrison is the only person Victor has in his pocket? The sheriff's department depends on Blackwood money for half their budget. And even if we found honest cops, what evidence would we present? Victor has documentation showing that Rosa is being cared for by family, and I technically agreed to his arrangement of my own free will. Any lawyer he hired would make it look like I was trying to extort money from a respectable businessman." Dan stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression carrying a desperation that matched her own. "So we run, tonight, all of us. We get Sophie and we drive until we're somewhere Victor's money can't reach." "And then what?" Maya asked. "Sophie deserves better than life as a fugitive. She's already lost her mother. She shouldn't have to lose her stability and her home because of my problems. And even if we could disappear successfully, what kind of life would that be for her? Always looking over our shoulders, never knowing if we're truly safe or just postponing. The inevitable?" The questions hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of choices that offered no good outcomes. Maya could see in Dan's eyes the same helpless rage she felt, the fury of good people trapped by circumstances beyond their control and forced to choose between different forms of destruction. A soft knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Sophie peered around the edge, her small face creased with worry. "Daddy, Maya? You're talking really loud, and you sound scared. Is everything okay?" Dan immediately crossed to his daughter, kneeling down to her eye level with the practiced ease of a parent who had learned to edge his own emotions for the sake of his child's security. "Everything's going to be fine, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle despite the storm raging behind his eyes. "Maya and I are just working through some grown-up problems." Sophie studied both their faces with the perceptive intensity that children brought to adult situations they sensed but didn't understand. "Is Maya going to leave us?" she asked, the question carrying a weight of abandonment fears that made Maya's chest tighten with pain. "Nobody's going anywhere," Dan said firmly, though Maya could hear the uncertainty beneath his reassurance. "We're a family now, and families stick together no matter what." Maya felt her heart break at the promise Dan was making, knowing that she would have to shatter it within the next few hours. Sophie had already lost her mother to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Now she would lose Maya to circumstances that felt equally inevitable but far more cruel. "Can I help with the grown-up problems?" Sophie asked with the earnest desire to contribute that characterized her approach to family challenges. "I'm really good at solving puzzles, and maybe I could think of something you haven't tried yet. Dan gathered his daughter into a hug, holding her tightly as if physical contact could somehow protect her from the adult complexities that threatened to tear their small family apart. You help just by being you, he told her. But right now, the best thing you can do is finish your homework while Maya and I figure some things out. After Sophie returned to the living room, Dan and Maya sat in the gathering darkness of the office, both of them struggling with the reality that their options had narrowed to a single impossible choice. Maya would have to leave for Springfield soon, and neither of them had found a way to prevent that departure without endangering the people they both loved. I could come with you, Dan said suddenly. Follow you to the hotel. Make sure you're safe. Maya turned to stare at him, horrified by the suggestion. And leave Sophie alone? Or bring her along to witness whatever happens in that hotel room? Dan, think about what you're saying. I can call Mrs. Patterson to stay with Sophie, Dan replied, though Maya could see him working through the flaws in his own plan even as he spoke. Or take her to Tommy's for the night. And then what? Maya asked. Storm into the hotel and rescue me? Victor would have you arrested for assault, and Sophie would lose the only parent she has left. Or maybe you just sit in the parking lot, knowing exactly what was happening to me, but unable to do anything about it. How would that help anyone? Dan slumped back in his chair, the weight of their impossible situation finally breaking through. His determination to find a solution through sheer force of will. I can't just let you walk into that nightmare, he said quietly. Not when I know what it's going to do to you. Maya reached across the space between them and took his hands, memorizing the calloused warmth of his fingers against her skin. You're not letting me do anything, she said. I'm making a choice to protect the people I love, including you and Sophie. It's not the choice I want to make, but it's the only one that keeps everyone safe. What about keeping you safe? Dan asked. Doesn't that matter too? Maya was quiet for a long moment, thinking about safety and what it really meant in a world where people like Victor Blackwood could buy and sell human dignity with casual indifference. I've learned that safety is relative, she said finally. Right now the safest thing for everyone I care about is for me to honor the arrangement Victor made. Rosa gets her medical care, you and Sophie keep your life here in Cedar Falls, and I survive whatever comes next. Dan's grip on her hands tightened. That's not survival, Maya. That's sacrifice. And the person you're sacrificing doesn't deserve what's about to happen to her. Maybe not, Maya agreed. But the people I'm protecting don't deserve to suffer for my problems either. And if I have to choose between my well-being and theirs, the choice is obvious. As the evening deepened around them, Maya began the painful process of preparing to leave the life she had briefly been allowed to share. She had so few possessions that packing took only minutes, but saying goodbye to the small routines and comforts she had found here would take much longer. Every mundane detail of the apartment had become precious to her. The coffee mug Dan had given her to use, the corner of the couch where she had spent her mornings sketching, the window that looked out onto the quiet street where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. Sophie helped Maya fold her few clothes into a small bag, chattering about school and weekend plans with the assumption that Maya would be there to share them. The little girl's innocent faith in the permanence of their family arrangement was both heartbreaking and precious, a reminder of what Maya was protecting by making this sacrifice. Will you be back in time for my school play next week? Sophie asked as she handed Maya a drawing she had made that afternoon. I'm playing a tree in the forest scene, and I want you to see my costume. Maya accepted the drawing with hands that trembled only slightly, studying the cheerful crayon figures that depicted their small family standing together outside the auto repair shop. Sophie had drawn them holding hands, all three of them smiling, with a sun shining overhead and flowers growing in the yard. It was the kind of picture that belonged on a refrigerator door, the visual representation of a life Maya would never be allowed to live. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Maya said. The lie coming easily because the truth would only hurt a child who had already experienced too much loss. Dan watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway, his face carrying the kind of anguish that came from watching powerlessly, as circumstances destroyed everything he had tried to build. Maya could see him struggling with his own helplessness, fighting against every instinct that told him to protect the people he loved, regardless of the consequences. At 9 o'clock, Maya knew she could delay no longer. The drive to Springfield would take 2 hours even if traffic cooperated, and arriving late would only give Victor additional justification for escalating his punishment of the people Maya was trying to protect. She gathered her small bag and Sophie's drawing, along with what remained of her courage, and prepared to walk away from the only home she had known since childhood. Sophie hugged her goodbye with the fierce intensity of a child who sensed that something important was happening, but didn't understand what. "See you tomorrow," she whispered against Maya's shoulder, the words carrying all the faith and innocence that Maya was about to sacrifice to keep this little girl safe. Dan walked Maya to her car, an old sedan that belonged to Rosa, but that Maya had been driving since her grandmother's hospitalization. The vehicle was nearly as battered as Maya felt, held together by determination and the kind of mechanical creativity that Dan had taught her during the brief time they had shared. "This isn't over," Dan said as Maya opened the driver's door. "Whatever happens tonight, this isn't the end of our story. I'll find a way to get you out of this, to bring you home where you belong." Maya wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that love could overcome the systematic advantages held by people like Victor Blackwood. But she had learned to recognize the difference between hope and denial, and she couldn't allow Dan to waste his life chasing impossible dreams when he had a daughter who needed him to be present and stable. "Take care of Sophie," Maya said instead of responding to his promise. "Make sure she knows that leaving her wasn't my choice, that I would stay if I could. And don't let her blame herself for any of this. Children always think adult problems are somehow their fault." Dan pulled her into his arms then, holding her with the desperate intensity of someone trying to memorize a moment he knew would have to last forever. Maya allowed herself to sink into his embrace, to absorb the warmth and strength and love he offered, storing it away like treasure she could revisit during the dark times ahead. "I love you," Dan whispered against her hair. "And that's not going to change, no matter what happens or how long it takes to fix this." Maya pulled back to look into his eyes one last time, memorizing the kindness she saw there, the concern that had no agenda attached to it. "I love you too," she said, allowing herself the luxury of complete honesty for perhaps the last time in her life. "Both of you. Thank you for showing me what family really means." The drive to Springfield passed in a blur of headlights and empty highway, Maya's mind cycling between memories of the past few days and dread of what awaited her at the Grandview Hotel. She had experienced something precious in Dan's apartment, had been allowed to glimpse what life could look like when it was built on mutual care rather than power and exploitation. That glimpse would have to sustain her through whatever came next. But as Maya pulled into the hotel parking lot, something unexpected was waiting for her. 3 police cars sat in the circular drive, their red and blue lights painting the building's facade in alternating colors. Officers moved purposefully through the lobby, and Maya could see additional law enforcement vehicles positioned around the building's perimeter. Confused and frightened, Maya parked at the edge of the lot and tried to understand what was happening. Her first thought was that Victor had orchestrated some kind of trap, that the police presence was designed to ensure her compliance or punish her for the delays she had caused. But as she watched the officers' movements, she realized their activity was focused on the hotel itself rather than on monitoring arriving guests. Her phone rang as she sat trying to decode the scene before her. Rebecca Chen's name appeared on the caller ID, surprising Maya since the social worker rarely called in the evening and have never contacted her at night. "Maya, thank God," Rebecca said as soon as Maya answered. "Are you safe? Are you somewhere? Victor Blackwood can't reach you?" Maya stared at the police activity surrounding the hotel, her mind struggling to process this unexpected development. I'm not sure." "Rebecca, what's happening? Why are you calling me now?" "We've been trying to reach you for hours," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying an excitement Maya had never heard from the usually composed social worker. "Everything has changed. Maya, Victor Blackwood was arrested this afternoon on federal charges of human trafficking and racketeering. The FBI has been investigating him for months, and they finally had enough evidence to move." Maya felt the world tilt around her as she absorbed this information. What does that mean? What about Rosa? What about the arrangement? "Rosa is safe," Rebecca said quickly. The so-called nephew was actually an FBI informant who was gathering evidence about Victor's operation. "Your grandmother is being transferred back to Cedar Falls tomorrow, and her medical care is being covered by a victim's compensation fund while the federal case moves forward." Maya stared at the police lights flashing against the hotel windows, beginning to understand that what she was witnessing was not a trap, but a rescue operation that had been months in the making. "The client Victor mentioned, Mr. Harrison, is actually Agent Harrison, FBI," Rebecca confirmed. "He's been posing as one of Victor's clients to gather evidence about the trafficking operation. Victor walked right into their trap when he arranged tonight's meeting." For a moment, Maya couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the magnitude of what Rebecca was telling her. The nightmare that had consumed her life for months was ending not because of her sacrifice, but because other people had been working to stop Victor's crimes all along. The choice she had been forced to make between her freedom and her grandmother's safety had been based on false premises, manipulated by a man who was apparently less powerful than he had pretended to be. "Maya, are you still there?" Rebecca's voice carried concern for Maya's silence. "I'm here," Maya managed. I can't believe it's over." "It's over," Rebecca confirmed. "You're free, Maya. You can go home." Home. The word carried weight that Maya was only beginning to understand. Home wasn't the apartment above, Chun's Market, where she had struggled to care for Rosa while working 3 jobs. Home wasn't the place where she had been ground down by impossible circumstances and predatory manipulation. Home was an apartment above an auto repair shop where a single father and his daughter had shown her what family really meant. Home was morning coffee in mismatched mugs and children's drawings on the refrigerator door, and the quiet confidence that came from being valued for who you were rather than what you could provide. Maya started her car and pulled out of the hotel parking lot, leaving the flashing lights and federal agents behind as she drove toward Cedar Falls and the life she had thought she would never be allowed to claim. The road stretched before her, no longer leading toward nightmare, but toward hope, toward love, toward the kind of future she had only dared to dream about during the darkest moments of the past few months. As she drove through the night toward Dan and Sophie, toward the family that had chosen her when she couldn't choose herself, Maya finally understood what Rebecca meant when she said that sometimes help came from unexpected directions. Sometimes the people who seemed powerless were actually part of something larger, something that worked slowly but inevitably toward justice. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love really was enough to overcome the forces that tried to destroy it. Sometimes the good guys won, and the people who chose kindness over cruelty got to keep the families they had fought so hard to protect. Maya pressed the accelerator and raced toward home, toward the life she was finally free to claim, toward the love that had been waiting for her to believe she deserved it. Behind her, the lights of Springfield faded into memory, along with all the nightmare scenarios that would never come to pass. Ahead lay Cedar Falls, and Dan, and Sophie, and the ordinary miracle of being allowed to stay where you were loved. The porch light at Carter Auto Repair glowed like a beacon against the midnight darkness as Maya pulled into the familiar parking lot. Every window in the apartment above the shop blazed with warm yellow light, and she could see Dan's silhouette, pacing back and forth behind the kitchen curtains. He had been waiting for her, probably since the moment she left for Springfield, unwilling to sleep while she faced what they both believed would be the destruction of everything they had built together. Maya sat in her car for a moment, absorbing the sight of this place that had become home in ways she was still learning to understand. The modest building with its peeling paint and hand-lettered sign represented safety and belonging in a way that no grand mansion ever could. Here, she had learned what it meant to be valued for who she was rather than what she could provide, to be part of a family that chose to love her without agenda or expectation. Before she could even turn off the engine, Dan burst through the shop's front door and down the steps, moving with the desperate urgency of someone who had convinced himself he might never see her again. Maya opened her car door and found herself swept into his arms, lifted off her feet and spun around as if her physical presence was the only proof he would accept that she was really, truly safe. "I thought I'd lost you," Dan whispered against her hair, his voice rough with emotion he had been holding back for hours. "When you left tonight, I thought that was it, that I'd never see you again except maybe in some courtroom where I'd have to watch other people decide what happened to your life." Maya pulled back to look into his face, seeing the exhaustion and fear and overwhelming relief written in every line around his eyes. "I'm here," she said simply. "I'm safe and I'm home, and I'm never leaving again unless you ask me to." "Never," Dan said fiercely. "I will never ask you to leave. This is where you belong, with us, with Sophie and me. We're a family now, and families don't abandon each other when things get difficult." Behind them, the apartment door opened and Sophie appeared on the steps, rubbing sleep from her eyes and wearing pajamas decorated with cartoon unicorns. Maya had never seen anything more beautiful than this sleepy 7-year-old who had waited up past her bedtime to make sure Maya came home safely. "Maya!" Sophie called, running down the steps with the fearless energy of a child who had never doubted that the adults in her life would keep their promises. "Daddy said you had to go take care of some grown-up business, but that you'd be back. I saved you some of the cookies we made after dinner." Maya knelt down to Sophie's level and gathered the little girl into a hug that felt like coming back to life. "I told you I wouldn't miss your school play," she said, remembering the promise she had made earlier that evening when she believed it was a lie. Trees are very important in forest scenes. The whole production would fall apart without a good tree. Sophie giggled and took Maya's hand, tugging her toward the apartment with the impatience of a child who had important things to share. "Come see what I drew while you were gone. It's a picture of our family, but this time I made sure to draw the shop too, because that's part of our home." As they climbed the steps together, Dan's hand warm against Maya's back, she felt the last of the tension that had gripped her for months finally begin to release. The nightmare was over. Not because of any sacrifice she had made, but because other people had been working quietly and persistently to ensure that predators like Victor Blackwood couldn't continue to destroy lives with impunity. The apartment felt different now, not just like a temporary refuge, but like a real home where she had every right to belong. Sophie's latest artwork covered the coffee table, depicting their small family in increasingly elaborate scenarios. Grocery shopping together, working in the garden they didn't yet have, celebrating birthdays and holidays, and all the ordinary milestones that marked the passage of a shared life. "I kept thinking about what you said," Sophie explained as she showed Maya each drawing, "about how families stick together no matter what. So I drew all the things we're going to do together, like going to the zoo and teaching you how to fish, and having Christmas morning with a really big tree." Maya studied each picture with the attention they deserved, marveling at the child's absolute confidence that their family would have a future filled with ordinary happiness. Sophie had never doubted that Maya would return, had simply accepted her place in their lives as permanent and begun planning accordingly. The trust was humbling and precious, a reminder of what Maya was fighting to protect and preserve. Dan made hot chocolate while Maya and Sophie spread the drawings across the living room floor, creating an exhibition of hopes and dreams rendered in crayon and colored pencil. The domestic routine felt surreal after the terror of the evening, but it also felt exactly right, as if this was what normal life was supposed to look like when it wasn't constantly threatened by external forces. "Tell me everything," Dan said. Once Sophie had finally been coaxed back to bed with promises that Maya would still be there in the morning. "From the beginning, what happened at the hotel?" Maya recounted the entire evening. Victor's phone call and his casual cruelty. The drive to Springfield filled with dread and resignation. The unexpected sight of police cars and federal agents. That had changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. Dan listened with growing amazement, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. "An FBI investigation," he said when Maya finished her account. "For months while we were trying to figure out how to fight back with our own resources, there were federal agents building a case that would put Victor away for decades." Maya nodded, still struggling to process the revelation herself. Rebecca said they had been watching him for almost a year, documenting his operation and gathering evidence. "Apparently I wasn't the first woman he had coerced into these arrangements. There were others going back several years, and their testimonies provided the foundation for the federal case." The knowledge that she hadn't been Victor's only victim was simultaneously heartbreaking and validating. Maya felt grief for the other women who had suffered under his manipulation, but also a sense of solidarity with survivors who had found the courage to come forward and help law enforcement build a case that would prevent future victimizations. "What happens now?" Dan asked. "With the legal case, I mean. Will you have to testify?" "Probably," Maya said. But Rebecca said the prosecutors are confident they have enough evidence to convict without requiring victim testimony, if any of us prefer not to relive the trauma in court. They have financial records, recorded phone calls, witness statements from federal agents who posed as clients. Victor kept detailed records of his operation because he never believed anyone would be able to challenge him. Dan reached for Maya's hands, holding them gently as if she might disappear again if he didn't maintain physical contact. "And Rosa? Is she really safe?" Maya's smile was the first completely unguarded expression of joy Dan had seen from her since they met. "She's coming home tomorrow. Not to the apartment over Chun's Market, because that building is part of Victor's assets that are being seized by the federal government. But Rebecca said there's a new assisted living facility on the other side of town that has an opening, and Rosa's care will be covered by victim compensation funds until we can figure out something more permanent." The relief in Maya's voice was profound, the sound of someone who had been carrying an impossible weight finally being allowed to set it down. Dan could see the change in her posture, the way her shoulders had relaxed and her breathing had deepened. For the first time since he had met her, Maya looked like someone who wasn't constantly calculating threats and weighing impossible choices. "There's something else," Maya continued, her voice growing quieter. "Rebecca said that once the federal case is resolved, there might be opportunities for financial compensation. Not just for immediate needs like medical care, but significant amounts that could provide real security for survivors of Victor's operation." Dan studied her face carefully, reading the emotions that played across her features. "That would change everything for you," he said. "Give you options you've never had before. The ability to go anywhere, do anything, start fresh wherever you wanted." Maya heard the question beneath his statement, the fear that financial independence might mean she would choose to leave Cedar Falls and the life they had been building together. She understood his concern, because she might have felt the same way if their positions were reversed. Money meant choices, and choices could lead away from this small town and the modest life Dan could offer her here. "It would give me options," Maya agreed. but it wouldn't change what I want. I've spent my whole life dreaming about having enough money to feel secure, but I never understood that security isn't really about money. It's about belonging somewhere, being part of something larger than yourself, having people who care about your well-being just because they love you. Dan's expression softened as he absorbed what she was telling him. Are you saying you want to stay? Even if you could afford to go anywhere, do anything? Maya leaned forward and kissed him, a gentle touch that carried all the promises she had been afraid to make when their future was uncertain. I'm saying that home isn't a place you buy, she said against his lips. It's a place where people choose to love you, and where you choose to love them back. I found my home here, with you and Sophie. Why would I leave? They talked until nearly dawn, sharing dreams and fears and plans for a future that finally seemed possible. Dan told Maya about the expansion ideas he had shelved because he couldn't afford the startup costs, about the community college courses he wanted to take to learn new skills, about the house with a yard where Sophie could have a dog and a garden where they could grow their own vegetables. Maya talked about finishing her nursing degree, about the satisfaction she felt when helping people heal from trauma, about the possibility of starting a support program for other survivors of trafficking and exploitation. She wanted to transform her own experience of victimization into something that could help others navigate their way back to safety and autonomy. As the sun began to rise over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that Maya had learned to associate with new beginnings, they finally acknowledged that they needed sleep before facing the practical challenges of rebuilding their lives. But neither of them wanted to end this conversation, this planning session for a future that belonged to them rather than to the people who had tried to control and exploit them. One more thing, Dan said as they prepared to separate for a few hours of rest. I want to make this official. Not just because of what we've been through together, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that every day. Will you marry me, Maya Rodriguez? The proposal wasn't accompanied by a ring or elaborate planning, or any of the romantic gestures that movies had taught Maya to expect. It was offered simply and honestly, a request for partnership from someone who had already proven his commitment through actions rather than words. Maya thought about the life Dan was offering her, ordinary and modest, and filled with the kind of daily challenges that came from building something real rather than something perfect. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I want to be your wife and Sophie's stepmom, and part of this family officially and permanently. I want to help you build something beautiful here, something that other people can look at and know that love really does win sometimes. Sophie's delighted shriek from the hallway indicated that their conversation had not been as private as they thought, and within moments they were engulfed by a 7-year-old who was bouncing with excitement about the prospect of having Maya as her official family member. Can I be in the wedding? Sophie demanded. Can I help pick out your dress? Can we have cake? Can Maya wear my grandmother's ring that Daddy keeps in the special box? The questions tumbled over each other with the rapid-fire enthusiasm that characterized Sophie's approach to exciting developments. Maya found herself laughing for the first time in months, not the careful laughter of someone trying to maintain appearances, but the genuine joy of someone who was surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. Yes to all of it, Maya said, lifting Sophie into her arms and spinning her around the way Dan had spun Maya in the parking lot hours earlier. We'll plan the most beautiful small-town wedding Cedar Falls has ever seen, and you'll be the most important person there, because you're the one who helped me learn what family really means. The next few months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, wedding planning, and the ordinary challenges of building a life together. Maya testified before a federal grand jury about Victor's operation, adding her voice to those of other survivors who had found the courage to ensure that their experiences would help convict the man who had tried to destroy their lives. Victor Blackwood was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison on charges of human trafficking. racketeering, and conspiracy. His assets were seized and liquidated, with the proceeds directed toward victim compensation and programs designed to help survivors rebuild their lives. Maya never saw him again after the night of his arrest, but she read about his sentencing in the Cedar Falls newspaper with a sense of closure that felt like the final page of a very dark chapter. Rosa moved into the assisted living facility with the grace and adaptability that had characterized her entire approach to life's challenges. She decorated her small apartment with family photos and potted plants, quickly becoming one of the facility's most popular residents, thanks to her storytelling abilities and her willingness to teach other residents how to make traditional Mexican pastries. Maya visited her grandmother every day, sharing stories about wedding preparations and her progress toward completing her nursing degree. Rosa had worried initially about Maya's decision to marry Dan so quickly after such dramatic experiences, but those concerns evaporated the first time she saw them together. The way Dan looked at Maya, with respect and tenderness and absolute devotion, convinced Rosa that her granddaughter had found something rare and precious. "He sees you," Rosa told Maya one afternoon as they sat in the facility's garden, watching other residents tend to vegetables and flowers. "Not what you can do for him or how you can make his life easier, but who you are inside. That's the foundation of real love, Mia. When someone sees your heart and chooses to protect it." The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in the small church where Dan's family had worshiped for 3 generations. Maya wore a simple white dress that she had chosen with Sophie's enthusiastic approval, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Dan had picked from the fields outside town. Sophie served as both flower girl and ring bearer, taking her responsibilities with the seriousness that she brought to all important family matters. Tommy Sullivan served as Dan's best man, and Rebecca Chun stood beside Maya as her maid of honor, representing the community of people who had supported them through their darkest times. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by neighbors and friends who had watched their love story unfold with the kind of investment that small towns brought to the happiness of their residents. Maya's favorite moment of the entire day came during the reception, held in the community center with decorations that Sophie had helped design. She was dancing with Dan to a song that the local high school band had learned especially for their wedding, when she caught sight of Rosa sitting at a table near the dance floor, tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her grandmother was surrounded by new friends from the assisted living facility, women who had become her chosen family in this new phase of her life. They were all crying too, overcome by the beauty of witnessing love triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy it. Maya realized that this was what victory looked like, not dramatic confrontations or grand gestures, but ordinary people choosing to care for each other despite the risks involved. 6 months after the wedding, Maya graduated from the community college's nursing program with honors and immediately accepted a position at the county hospital's trauma unit. She specialized in working with patients who had experienced violence or exploitation, bringing to her work a combination of professional training and personal understanding that made her extraordinarily effective at helping people heal. Dan expanded Carter Auto Repair into a full-service garage that employed 3 mechanics and served customers from across the county. The business success allowed them to buy a small house with a yard where Sophie could have the dog she had been requesting for years, and where Maya could plant the garden she had dreamed about during her darkest moments. Sophie thrived in her new role as big sister to the rescue puppy they adopted from the county shelter, a mixed-breed dog with boundless energy and an intuitive understanding of when people needed comfort. Maya often came home from difficult days at the hospital to find Sophie and the dog waiting for her in the garden, ready to share stories about school and help harvest vegetables for dinner. On the first anniversary of Victor's arrest, Maya received a letter from another survivor of his trafficking operation, a young woman who had read about Maya's work with trauma patients and wanted to thank her for giving her the courage to seek help. The letter described how seeing Maya's testimony on the news had convinced the woman that recovery was possible, that victims could reclaim their lives and build something beautiful from the wreckage of their experiences. Maya kept the letter in her desk at work, reading it whenever she encountered patients who seemed to have lost hope for their own healing. It reminded her that survival was not just about enduring trauma, but about transforming that experience into something that could help others find their way back to safety and autonomy. 2 years after their wedding, Maya and Dan sat on the front porch of their small house, watching Sophie practice softball in the backyard while the rescue dog chased butterflies among the tomato plants. The evening was warm and peaceful, filled with the ordinary sounds of a family life that Maya had once believed was beyond her reach. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bid on me that night?" Maya asked, settling against Dan's shoulder as they shared the porch swing that had come with the house. Dan was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but not in a way that makes me feel like we were lucky or that things could have gone differently. I think we were always going to find each other, one way or another. People who are meant to be together usually are, even when the circumstances seem impossible." Maya thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Rosa's illness, Victor's predatory scheme, the FBI investigation that had been building for months without her knowledge, the federal agents who had risked their own safety to gather evidence against a powerful man. None of it had felt like destiny at the time, but looking back, she could see how each terrible moment had been necessary to bring her to this place of belonging and peace. "I used to think that strength meant enduring whatever happened to you without asking for help," Maya said. "But I've learned that real strength is accepting love when it's offered, even when you don't think you deserve it, especially then." Sophie's laughter drifted across the yard as the dog finally caught one of the butterflies it had been chasing, only to immediately release it unharmed and begin pursuing another. Maya watched the scene of pure joy and innocence, knowing that she had helped create a world where this child could grow up, believing that love was stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it. "I love our life," Maya said simply, "all of it. Even the hard parts that brought us together, because they taught us what we were willing to fight for." Dan tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I love our life too," he agreed. "And I love that we built it together, that we chose each other every day, even when choosing was difficult." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Maya of all the new beginnings she had witnessed, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had learned that healing was possible, that love could triumph over exploitation, and that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage when they were fighting to protect the people they cared about. The sound of Sophie calling them in for dinner interrupted their peaceful contemplation, and Maya rose to join her family for the evening meal. As they walked into the house together, Maya caught sight of their reflection in the front window, 3 people who had found each other across circumstances that should have kept them apart, who had chosen to build something beautiful despite the forces that had tried to destroy them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, patients who needed healing, and a community that depended on their contributions. But tonight there was this, the warmth of home, the laughter of family, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that love really could overcome the darkness when people were brave enough to choose it over fear. Maya had found her place in the world, not as someone's property or burden, but as a partner, mother, nurse, and survivor who had transformed her trauma into a source of strength for others. She had learned that home wasn't something you bought or inherited, but something you built with people who saw your worth and chose to protect it. And in a small town in Missouri, in a house with a garden and a rescue dog and a little girl who drew pictures of their family's future adventures, Maya Rodriguez Carter had everything she had ever dreamed of and more than she had ever dared to hope for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.